Welcome to the CBCS seminar, and we have Professor Vanessa Tomlinson and Dr. Ali Bishop from Griffith University, and they both collaborate together on the Creative Arts Research Institute. So I believe Vanessa is from the Queensland Conservatory and you're percussionist and composer. Amazing. And Ali is more into visual arts, but they collaborate together, and they're going to give us a talk today about how we can use artistic engagement to get people to care more about the environment so that we can conserve it.
Thank you. Do you want to come up, Ali? Hello, everyone. So good to be here. Thanks for the invitation. We're just going to start by just locating who we are so you get a tiny bit of knowledge, because we're two random humans that have come into your space. I am Vanessa. I was born in Adelaide, grew up in the Adelaide Hills. Back in the days when like a national park was your backyard and you could just go running amok, and I was the youngest kid, so I was the one that was always thrown into the tunnel first or the cave first or the whatever first. So had a pretty delightful and reasonably fearless upbringing. And the other really important part of that time was that I took up piano lessons, and the piano was located in a part of the house that was the adults only room, the lounge room. So by playing the piano, I could be in the quiet place in the house. So that just became my obsession. So music and environment have just always been like two very equidistant and important things. I moved to California through the 90s and did my master's and doctoral studies at UC San Diego. And that's important because they set up the arts to be like the sciences. So in other words, instead of being like historic study of arts practices, it had to be forward-thinking, experimental, innovative, technological, and it had to be collaborative. So we were collaborating across disciplines as students. Came back here, moved to Melbourne, and then accidentally got a job, which I always think is every job is accidental, and have been at Griffith for 20 years. I was also the director of the Creative Arts Research Institute for 4 years, and my happiness right now is because I'm really
I didn't know you were the youngest. I'm also the youngest.
Oh, there you go.
I was born here in Brisbane, so-called Brisbane, Mianjin, on Yagara and Turrbal country. Approximately 12 to 1300 years ago, I was a science student here at the University of Queensland. So my honours was in microbiology. That was a very, very long time ago. And then I took a circuitous route through policy into visual arts, but always retaining this curiosity about and thinking through forms of engagement and ways of framing that the sciences gave me, and bringing that to my practice. So when I finished, so my doctorate was in visual arts through UNSW, but I spent most of that time living in Berlin. So I lived in Berlin for 12 years. And a lot of that time I spent working in this interdisciplinary art studio with an artist called Tomas Saraceno, who has, amongst other things, Spider Lab. And I was leading the research in the Spider Lab. And in Saraceno's practice, the spider, particularly web building spiders, become a kind of a heuristic or a model and a framework, conceptually, materially, and sensorially, for thinking about how we might imagine the world, imagine relations otherwise. So some of those there were a lot of interdisciplinary collaborations that came out through that with the head of engineering at MIT around like web structure and biomechanics and properties of silk, with biotremologists and people specializing in vibrational communication, because spiders, web building spiders in particular, but all spiders using vibrational communication to get a sense of the world. And that opened up space for like interspecies concerts, musicians jamming with spiders. So this gives a bit of a sense for how arts and science comes together in my own practice, thinking about sensorial and material forms of engagement, and also speculative, like where a lot of my practice is something I call a science fictioning. So thinking about how scientific concepts and facts give a sort of a rich territory for thinking about how we might imagine relations and worlds otherwise and sort of cast into the future, which is part of what we'll be talking about, this idea of, you know, in perpetuity conservation. What does that even mean? And how do we start to think about futures? That's my intro.
So what we're going to do, I'm going to whip through just a few projects of mine, just to give you a bit of a taster of where I'm coming from. And then we'll kind of mix in some of the theory stuff that we've been thinking about to link it into the idea of conservation in particular, and finally landing on how private land ownership can be a tool for ecological conservation and how the arts can assist in that. So it's kind of going to be a fairly fast-paced tour. I'm going to be flashing colours at you, and we can always go back to something in question time. So for me as a musician, slash composer, slash improviser, we have terminology crises as well. I first became interested in place-based art or place-based music through the drought in the late noughties. You'll remember that sort of period, I think it was 2008-9, where every night on the news, Wivenhoe Dam is at 23%, Wivenhoe Dam is at 22%, oh, Wivenhoe Dam's fallen to 19%. And I did not understand what that meant. I didn't have any embodied knowledge of what that meant, except that the grass is growing brown outside my house. Oh, and so composer Eric Griswold went out to work with hydrologists and got a whole lot of data from the hydrologists. And we decided to do a sounding. I mean, obviously sounding is a measurement thing as well as a sonic sharing across parts of the dam that should not have been visible. So we had musicians standing on what should not be there, what should be absent from view, and playing across the water, which taught me, water is an amazing amplifier, it's an amazing sonic resource, but it also taught all the musicians about just the feeling of being on land that should not be revealed. I mean, of course, it's a man-made dam, we can go through all that stuff, but it was a really, really interesting moment. That led to something that I've kind of come to think of as a methodology of going into place, playing with objects and listening. So simple. Listening to what responds, listening to what doesn't respond, listening to the combination of man-made aeroplanes, we're just talking about aeroplanes flying over talks, or listening into natural systems, listening to weather, etc. And this is a project from 3 different sites, all within about 20 minutes of Brisbane CBD, and mangroves, that's a common theme today. Jumping forward, Brisbane Festival in 2020, I was commissioned to make a series of performances around Brisbane City that were outdoors. It was the end of COVID, it was during COVID, that brought people together, but not too together, to be in place in proximity to one another. And so I bought just this one object, which is a tam-tam, which is a very beautiful sounding object, acoustic. I played acoustic. And I was playing using the data from the skyline of Brisbane and the changing colour of the sky at dusk as my parameters to play the sound on the tam-tam. So you can think of it as an XY axis. You can think of it as one is frequency, one is timbre. You can assign anything to those 2 parameters and music can be made. It was such a beautiful, powerful gathering. People sitting there just looking out into the distance, not really looking at me, and meditating on what possibilities were happening in place. I was an artist in residence at the Eco-Science Precinct working with soil scientists and looking at the process of gullying, and did a few on-site investigations of embodied responses to gullies. And this is one where the group of artists involved went ahead and wanted to place protective cloth over the gully to kind of show its specialness and to show the rehabilitation want, but not the ability to do that. And this was a performance piece on camera, which has been shown in galleries all over the world. And it kind of just gives you a little sneak preview into that kind of care that can happen in the arts that doesn't actually change the gully, but it changes the perception of what can happen with this kind of landform. A piece at Bleach Festival, which was, I proposed to design a trio for ocean, acoustic instruments and electronics. Why? Because I wanted people to sit together at this site, which is North Burleigh Headland, if you know that particular place, and to really meditate on timescales. So the rock timescale, the geological timescale, mixed in with this constant ocean timescale, with the electronics kind of vibrating the rock, if you like. And in one instance, it's a really easy piece to make. You know, throwing 20 people on a rock face, getting them to play music without any ability to see one another. So it's all done by listening. But it's also trying to find out all of the habits of the ocean, the sonic habits of the ocean, so that no matter what the reality was on the day of performance, we could find a way of navigating through that, whether it was like crazy ocean or really soft ocean. And so the instrumentation and the kind of sonic material that we put into the place becomes really specific. So site-specific performance, every detail that one puts in there matters, and the research that goes behind that is where I think we can all be friends or future friends, because we need a lot of data to get that sort of thing happening. One thing that you probably know of from ecoacoustics, I don't know if anyone's involved in ecoacoustics, listening underwater, using microphones to hear various aspects that are otherwise inaudible to human ears. I've been involved in that from the other side, which is acoustic ecology. So they're both like twin fields. In this particular project, I took a piano from the mouth of the Murray River during the floods, last 2023 floods. So this was like in April 2023, and drove the piano following the Murray River system up to the Great Dividing Range, Clarence River, the start of the Clarence River near Stanthorpe. And did performances along the way using the underwater recordings to teach myself how to play the piano. So I was trying to play verbatim whatever I heard underwater. Wild. So you can imagine, like, just day after day doing that, I started to internalize the different species, the different habitats of what was happening underwater. I couldn't identify this stuff, but I can play it. So it's a really like interesting way of putting that inside the physicality of the body. And that again is a like a touring art gallery piece, not so much a live performance piece, although we do live performances of that too. And I just wanted to link now into what Ali was talking about with speculation. I started a series of works a few years ago about imagination and imagining soundscapes, because I was obsessed by megafauna. And I couldn't work out what megafauna might have sounded like. And so instead of doing an analysis of, you know, the physicality of megafauna and the size of the throat or the size of the growl would be, I decided to think about the awkwardness of megafauna and the way it interacted with its environment. So the first one there is imagining the sound of Zyglossys hecketes' spines rubbing against a tree. So that's the giant echidna. But how I just imagine that each one of those spines would sound remarkable if it flicks against a tree, and each one would be a slightly different pitch. And what this has done is opened up that research, that kind of journey that I just explained in 1 second, to every musician that plays it. And this has been played, I don't know, hundreds of times around the world. It's kind of become a concert piece like, you know, Beethoven, but in 2020, whatever. And these are all critically endangered or extinct species. But the pig-footed bandicoot dreaming, like what does dreaming even sound like? And then what does dreaming sound like to a pig-footed bandicoot? And immediately I go, well, where is it sleeping? What's its environment? What's happening? And those kinds of layers of questions that start to be unpacked by the musician and shared with the audience become really fascinating. Do you want me to pause for a second before I go into Harrigan's Lane?
It's to sort of open up an idea of the art of noticing. So I think one of the bigger, and I think it was if you glanced at the abstract for this talk, we talk about this idea of matters of care and thinking about what these kinds of practices can bring to conservation. So conservation is broadly a practice of care, but not only care. But thinking about what kind of practices and methods might be important for that. And there's this idea of the arts of noticing that, you know, I don't want to say that it's singularly a creative practice, because I know that ecology is also something that is very much sort of originally about observation, you know, particular observations in the field informing and becoming part of that scientific habit and practice. But that there's something, it's a muscle that's well developed in creative practitioners, and it's something that can be used to kind of call a different form of attention to spaces that maybe have become familiar or backgrounded, or something that within these practices that activates a different sensibility to a place and therefore opens up the space for a different kind of relationship to that place. Maybe one that sort of gradually moves into forms of care. And I think, I don't want to get too much into theory, but I'm thinking about this, what care means and how an affective dimension, so not just a cognitive, rational approach, but how care kind of implies or implicates you in the relationship. And that these kind of bodily processes, some of the examples that Vanessa's been talking through, are ways of opening onto the affective possibilities of developing a relationship with place, how that might move you to care. That kind of.
Yeah, and I mean, I was just thinking about Hugh Fossingham's Dare to Everyone about, you know, talking to politicians. It's really how do you activate the care, and what role can arts play in helping that activation process? So we'll just jump into, there's two sites that we've been looking at, and I want to acknowledge here Xu Chen, who I accidentally met because of her research into private land ownership and conservation, because I accidentally purchased a nature refuge. And I say accidentally because I was just looking for a piece of land to buy, and by far the cheapest piece of land I could buy was a nature refuge because it was the most unusable. So its value per acre was much lower than anything else. And there was only a couple of things like, oh, well, you can't have dogs and you can't build anywhere. And I was like, that's okay. I'm in with that. I can just, you know, put up a tent, I'll be fine. And then she was, I was one of her research participants, and I became really interested in what she was doing. I've always been interested in what Ali's doing, and together with a researcher who's actually originally from here, Professor Kumi Kato. Everyone know Kumi? She's now at Wakayama University in sustainable tourism, but she's the fourth arm of our team. So the two sites that I've been really, really deeply engaged with and learning to care for, learning to listen to, are this site here, which is at Harrigan's Lane. You're looking at regrowth messmate here. So it's quite a monoculture in this particular area because it was cleared. It's now under a conservation agreement in New South Wales. And I've been doing art projects there for about 15 years. So really trying to learn this land. On the land, it's worth noting, is this building / instrument called the piano mill, which houses 16 pre-loved pianos. It's kind of, I think of it as an old folks home for pianos. So they're taken as is and put in there. They're Botox free, so there's no tuning. They don't have to be snapped into shape. They're allowed to sag and weather as they like, and they're sounded by 16 humans. So it takes 16 people to run the mill. And this is kind of the centerpiece of this site, but it's surrounded by 100 acres of bushland, which is where I get to do a lot of my play work. I was talking to Carissa, who's been up there to one of these events. And this is one of our events that happened at Easter, where people go on a walk and they encounter all kinds of music that's reacting in different ways to the bush. Here, someone is doing semaphore poetry. So literally doing poems to the bush in semaphore to another human who's responding with other lines. There's individuals playing. This is like a live 9 people simultaneously, but spread by kilometres in distance. So you kind of navigate through and encounter things. And we'll talk about, you know, how that's beneficial or not. But the kind of idea of putting someone in a place is that it puts literally a frame around that place. And people's direction and attention comes toward. And by coming toward, you then actually open your ears outward. It's a really bizarre kind of process that the focus actually expands your potential of sensorial awareness. This is what I've learned. So when I'm dealing with all of these sites and all of these possibilities, these are the variables that I'm working with as a sonic artist. These are the things that I'm thinking of. And I hope if you look through that, there's some words that you might think of from your own research. And if I was to choose any 3, I don't know, if I was just to go weather, dryness, wetness, any work that I make sonically will sound different in every kind of weather system. That's fairly obvious. But if it's been a long drought, if it's been a long wet season, the whole sonic properties change. And kind of drawing my attention into that makes me notice all of the other things that change along with that. You know, with the wetness comes the leeches, with the dryness comes the snakes, you know, you can go into all kinds of different things. So the whole sort of shape shifting of the landscape gets revealed through these kinds of projects. Do you want to say?
Leading into Weiler and this idea of knottiness.
Yeah.
So again, you know, we're thinking about this framework of matters of care because it's got some really interesting ways of thinking about what we're doing and what care might mean. And one of the ways that you know, it's described as care is a critically disruptive doing, but also a kind of moving through things that are maybe not easy to come to grips with. Some of the knots where Vanessa and I tend to lodge ourselves. And is this talking about perpetuity as a kind of a knot? Yeah, so what does it mean, an in perpetuity covenant? What does that mean in terms of our responsibilities there? You know, in perpetuity covenants might suggest a sort of a stability of legal and political framework, an unchanging sort of, well, there's relative stability to how one thinks about what that, how that place might change over time. But thinking beyond that, forms of care are not, the forms of care that we're interested in conservation broadly is not just to leave it and lie and sort of, you know, leave it untouched as a kind of a forever principle, but thinking about the forms of care that are needed in that kind of covenant so that it's an ongoing relationship. And there's an idea that comes up sometimes when we're talking about how to think about time in this way. It's an idea by Kyle Powers-White, who's a Potawatomi scholar writing in environmental humanities from the States. He has this idea of time as kinship. So time is not this kind of like linear, divisible, you know, teleological thing, but it's something that unfolds through relationships, and kinships are particular forms of relationship that implicate you, that sort of demand forms of responsibility. So thinking about time as kinship and thinking about the in perpetuity covenant sort of opens up this idea of there needs to be sets of practices that are ongoing and responsive to what's happening and the changes that are happening, landscapes and communities that are there as they're unfolding and as they're emerging, so that it's not so that it requires continual engagement as a form of care. So
Yeah.
where we're going, yeah.
So this is Wyler Nature Refuge. It's up close to Girrawee National Park. It's connected through wildlife corridors, not up against that. And probably many of you know that's really poor nutrient soil, but really rich in biodiversity, partly because it can't be developed, some of those areas, because of granite outcrops. So it's kind of its inefficiencies or its problems are its strengths, that it cannot be wiped down, it cannot be, this cannot be erased. Although in all these valleys, you'll see that there's lots of grazing, that's where wine country is, that's where a lot of agriculture is happening. So it's a really fascinating site for multi-purpose use in a single area. And this particular site, like I said, I did not set up the nature refuge. That came before me in 2006, but it has particular species that are identified, that it's there to care for and look after. And if you don't know, a nature refuge is only a Queensland designation, and it's, as Ali said, it's an in perpetuity arrangement. And if anyone knows who set up that program in Queensland, they're a genius, because it is in perpetuity, and the government fads obviously change all the time, and there is no appetite right now to set up lots more. So there's not a natural appetite to go, oh yeah, let's really encourage people to turn their properties into in perpetuity national parks, basically. And the question is, why is that not in fashion right now? And how, when it is in fashion, we can really take advantage of that. And one of our motivations is the whole 30-30 concept, which is 30% of land and water by 2030 will be under some sort of covenants of looking after biodiversity. And obviously we're not on track to do that. And if anyone read The Guardian yesterday, I think there's a lot of the world that have now declared that they're not on track, that have signed up to this. Like more than 60% of the world are not on track. So it's a shocking thing. And we're trying to work out how this kind of process can be used as a communication device to both subversively encourage, but also much more overtly encourage the possibilities of multi-use for science and art projects on these various sites. So we have listed here, like these are the mission statements of these two properties. This is Harrigan's Lane Collective, where the piano mill is, and this is Wyler Nature Refuge. And specifically exploring how arts-based methods can attune audiences to processes, timescales and species present at Wyler, with the goal of fostering conservation as a practice of care across human and more than human boundaries, which is something that comes from a paper that we'll be presenting down in Tasmania soon.
Dan, you also raised this interesting point around like the knottiness of private land ownership as well, and how private land ownership can become a commons of a kind through these nature refuges, but also the opening up that happens when it becomes a site that hosts performances, events, residencies, as happens at Harrigan's Mill, Harrigan's Lane, Piano Mill, Harrigan's Mill, that inviting people in and opening it up and having sort of performative and other events becomes a way of also making it, rendering it a commons in careful ways, and not just a sort of a stampede of people through, but that kind of gentle commenting might be a way also to encourage others in the path of nature refuges, potentially. That's, in that district particularly as well, that's kind of a conversation that's been happening, that was there when Shu and I went down there for a weekend.
And probably the most famous nature refuge we have in Queensland is Bimblebox Nature Refuge, which some of you may know was in the path of Clive Palmer's mining dreams. And of course, a nature refuge does not protect you from underground resource grabbing. And they got a bunch of 500 artists to make artworks about the site, on site, and that's been touring Australia for 4 years now, non-stop, and has proactively helped in stopping that mining lease going ahead. So that I always take heart from that. It's deep, long-term commitment, but the arts do have this really interesting role where it kind of dislodges something in people in new ways, which provides a different access route. Not better, not worse, just another kind of access route to communicate ecological imperatives.
Yeah, artists are interested in these spaces and they can bring others into that sort of zone of interest with them, and that's where there's a real potential for these forms of care and interest. But yeah, I think we're also really interested in hearing from you around your thoughts about sort of the nature refuge and this commoning, or whether, yeah, I don't know, some of the things that we're still working out as we're going through this project around the knottiness of a nature refuge and the private versus public ownership.
And also just if you can imagine in your practice how arts can play a role, and how we can bridge those things. It's funny how disciplines have gotten separated out, and especially, I mean, imagine in environmental studies, it's like the arts in the sense that it is by nature interdisciplinary. Your knowledge must go beyond a singular, and your ability to communicate must go beyond a singular discipline. So I imagine that, I may be wrong. So yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts on what you imagine, what you speculate could happen in the future to bring us all to a better future together. The end from us.